Look who's talking! Israeli and Lebanese envoys appearing together on camera in the same room. It may well be a first. It's happening under the auspices of the U.S. Secretary of State in Washington. Now, if you're rooting for peace, there's good news and bad news. The good news is the Lebanese government's never been so vocal in calling on Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah to disarm. And the U.S. president has a real stake in reining in Israel if he wants his attempts to strike a deal with Tehran to bear fruits. The bad news, well, the fighting for now continues, with Israel accused of the Gaza-style leveling of villages in southern Lebanon and Hezbollah refusing both surrender and disarmament. Will Israel set up for good in southern Lebanon, pushing boundaries like it did recently in neighboring Syria? A week ago, Benjamin Netanyahu was depicted as omnipotent, with outlets like the New York Times reporting on how it was he who convinced Donald Trump to attack Iran back in February. If that was true, is it still the case that he has so much sway? Or was last Wednesday's daytime bombing of Beirut that killed more than 300 too much, even for Israel's closest allies? Today in the France 24 debate, what will it take to build a lasting peace between neighbors who, by the way, officially have still been at war since 1948? And we'll be joined from Jerusalem by France 24 correspondent Noga Tarnapovsky. Joining us now from Perugia in Italy, Nadim Houri, Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
From Washington, she's worked on Middle East diplomacy under several U.S. presidents. Elisa Ewers, a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations think tank. Welcome.
Thank you.
Former French ambassador to Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Bertrand Besancenot, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
On the go, by the way, you can listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. It's called Foggy Bottom, the headquarters of the U.S. State Department in Washington, the venue, as the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted the Lebanese on one side, the Israelis on the other. Emerald Maxwell has more.
These are their first direct talks in 43 years. Israel's ambassador to the US, Yehiel Leiter, seen here on the far right, and Lebanon's ambassador, Nader Hamadeh Mouawad, standing next to him, are meeting face-to-face in Washington, hosted by Marco Rubio.
The opportunity here, I know some of you are shouting questions about ceasefires. This is a lot more than just about that. This is about bringing a permanent end to 20 or 30 years of Hezbollah's influence.
Earlier in the day, the Israeli foreign minister said their fight wasn't with Lebanon, and that the two countries were on the same page when it came to Hezbollah.
Israel and Lebanon don't have any major disputes between them. The problem is Hezbollah, and this is the problem we must address.
But not everyone agrees with that view in Lebanon, particularly in the south, where many see Hezbollah as their only protectors against Israeli aggression.
These negotiations are the result of the war, but they must happen with all sides being on board. We should have a delegation made up of all the Lebanese parties and not have one party monopolize them.
Hezbollah opposes the talks, considering them tantamount to surrender.
We refuse negotiations with the Israeli entity. These negotiations are futile, and these negotiations need a Lebanese consensus.
As talks began, Hezbollah said it had targeted 13 northern Israeli towns, while Israel continued to batter Lebanon. This social media footage shows damage at a hospital in Tebnin in the south. Israel has ruled out a ceasefire and is continuing its invasion of southern Lebanon in order to build a buffer zone from the border to the Litani River.
And let's begin in Washington. Elisa Ewers, as we saw at the tail end of that report, peace is not breaking out. But what do you make of those images we saw earlier?
Well, that's exactly right. This is not a negotiation that is happening under normal circumstances. And peace is not imminent, but they are historic because both sides are talking directly, and they're doing so while there is active conflict happening on the ground between Hezbollah and Israel. So while the immediate need here is for de-escalation and trying to figure out how to extend a potential peace, the long-term goal is much more comprehensive.
And Noga Tarnapovsky, we're getting sort of conflicting messages. The foreign minister of Israel, who's talking about going towards a full normalization of ties, while the defense minister is talking about setting up shop for good in southern Lebanon.
That's right, Francois. And the prime minister says one thing one day and the other thing the other day. So for Israelis, the very fact that these talks are taking place is really very confusing. And by and large, the understanding among regular Israelis is that Israel was coerced into this by the United States, was forced into it. And it's not just regular Israelis. The government itself, Netanyahu, has boxed himself into a situation where any political or diplomatic solution, anything but war, is described by him as a capitulation. And so now, in view of the fact that the White House basically said to him, I'm quoting now President Trump, lay back, cut it down in Lebanon and engage in these talks, has put Netanyahu in a situation where, at least on the face of it, he had to go for these talks. And I do want to say there's a tragic element to this story, because Israel has, for most of its history, been the country that wanted recognition in the Middle East, that fought against the Arab boycott on it, that wanted to be recognized as a legitimate nation in the family of Middle East nations. And here you see a radically transformed Lebanese government. Today, the president of Lebanon said that it was historic, that it opened a new avenue for Lebanon to be in these talks with Israel. And it's the Israeli state that is saying, we're just here because we have to be.
Nadim Houri, how much is Donald Trump twisting Benjamin Netanyahu's arm?
So I don't know what's going on behind them, but I would agree, behind closed doors. But it's true that Israel has entered this war in Lebanon, and particularly since October 8, 2024, with their new security doctrine that we saw in Gaza, which is sort of a hegemonic, create a buffer zone, not interested in any political process. So will Trump succeed in getting the Israelis to accept a political process? And will this political process lay the basis for something more, which would mean ultimately withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon? That is something we don't know at this stage.
Bertrand Besancenot, you heard Elisa Ewers at the outset saying it's a little unorthodox, sitting down at the table while the guns are still raging.
It is not orthodox, and this is the reason why the Lebanese are insisting on the fact that there will be a negotiation only when the bombing stops. And this is very legitimate, because you cannot negotiate with a gun on your face.
So these are exploratory talks?
They are purely exploratory. Well, it is at the ambassador's level. And I think that the main purpose of this discussion is to see what would be the condition to start real negotiation. And it is clear as well, in my mind, that we are talking about a security agreement. We are not talking about normalization. This is something different that might happen later, but this is not the purpose of these discussions.
You're seeing that the U.S. Secretary of State is the one in the middle. We haven't seen the head of the diplomatic wing of the United States government in the middle of these kinds of negotiations much recently.
No. It's no. In a way, I'm not sure it is an historical event, but it is an important one, because it is clear that President Trump at some point had to twist the arm of Mr. Netanyahu, and this was because, of course, the Iranians made clear that if the bombing in Lebanon was going on, they would keep blocking the Hormuz Strait. So for that reason, President Trump, who wants apparently to have an agreement twist the arm of Netanyahu. And this, I think, is clear to everybody. Now, we know that Mr. Netanyahu is not so excited, and he would like to, what he called, finish the work in Lebanon concerning the Hezbollah. And it is, so he had to do so, but I suppose that he will not be very forward-looking to this discussion, hoping to keep for a while the military option.
Noga Tarnapovsky, we talk about this being historic. Earlier we were speaking with Lebanon's former foreign minister, Fares Bouyez. He remembers being in the same room as Israel during, for instance, the Madrid Accords of 1991. He doesn't remember, though, this kind of in front of the cameras photo op where you have just a bilateral, Israelis and Lebanese.
That's right. I really don't think this has happened before, Francois. I've kind of scoured my historic contacts and the history books. Lebanon and Israel have been in a state of war since 1948, sometimes a quieter state of war, but formal, and other times a very hot state of war, in particular since the rise of Hezbollah. So it is really a moving picture for anyone who follows the history of this region to see this Israeli ambassador standing side by side with the ambassador of Lebanon, and then across a table in discussions. I think there's no way to describe this other than a success, right? A photo op. Whether there will be any follow-up, we don't know. The discussions have just ended after 2 hours, and for now, there are no further talks scheduled. So we could end up with just a nice picture, or if pressure is put by the United States, I think we might be able to end up with something better than that.
Right, last week, the Trump administration asked Israel to hit pause on fighting, but Israel's pursued its ground incursion. The fighting's been particularly heavy the last few days around the southern town of Bin Jabal, a Hezbollah stronghold, which Israel says it surrounds. Right now, let's cross to France 24 senior correspondent Cyril Payen in the Lebanese capital. And to give an idea, I suppose, of the uphill struggle or the long road to peace ahead, the fighting's still going on, and we understand there were demonstrations against the talks in Washington where you are.
Well, actually, the demonstrations were called in the morning, but just cancelled because the Shiite leaders from Hezbollah and the Amal party just cancelled it and said it was not the due time. But indeed, Francois, it's a very, very strange situation what we're living here. The Lebanese we have been talking to in the past 48 hours, were just cautiously optimistic, but extremely cautious also about the outcome of what is happening now in Washington, because it has been 43 years with no talks between two parties which are technically at war which have been technically at war for decades. So many people were just saying, well, we are cautiously optimistic. Maybe it's under the pressure of Washington for the picture. So now, for the past hour, this picture with the representative of Israel, of Lebanon, the American officials, this picture is circulating on the social networks. And then the Lebanese says, well, let's say at least we talk about Lebanon. There is this statement. There was this statement by 70 countries putting some pressure, international pressure, at least and at last for having the Lebanese peace process included in the talk. So cautious or optimistic, but in the same way, the Lebanese knows that for the past 15 months, the strikes from Israel has been going on quite daily, including Beirut, the capital city, with this huge strike killing more than 350 people last Wednesday. And I can tell you that, as you were saying, the fighting is raging really much with a huge violence in the southern part of the country. country. The battle of Bint Jeb is requiring the forces, the elite forces of the Israeli army, with the Division 98 paratroopers, commandos, are fighting the Hezbollah in this place. Just for the past hours, since midnight yesterday, 35 villages in this area have been bombarded by the Israeli Air Force. So there is a sense of, yes, we're going to the table, we're going to have a framework for moving on forward to having maybe some negotiation for peace one time, but then also we are under fire from Israel, with putting a lot of more pressure on the southern Lebanon, but not only, because now some strikes are going east in the Bekaa, at close to the Syrian border. So it looks very much the Israelis are putting a lot of pressure, and in the same way are okay to negotiate. But then comes the preconditions of these talks, and we know that there are a lot of issues between the two countries. As we can say, the disarmament of the Hezbollah, it's a big issue. Everybody knows that it won't happen in 2 days or even in 1 year. Having first of all a ceasefire, this is something as a precondition which is rejected by the Israelis. So the picture is there, so people are quite okay by it, but a lot of people here in Lebanese, very frankly, Francois, thinks it will be it. After the picture, maybe nothing will come out from this meeting.
All right, always be pessimistic. That way you're never disappointed. Cyril Payan, many thanks for that live update from Beirut. Lots to unpack in what you're telling us about the situation on the ground there. Elisa Ewers, let me begin with you. Last Wednesday afternoon, that 10 minutes of bombing by Israel on central Beirut that killed more than 300. Was that kind of a tipping point even for the United States?
Well, I think there is no question that despite the fact that Israel is at war with Hezbollah, the impact is felt throughout Lebanon by the Lebanese people. Thousands killed, even more injured, 1.5 million displaced. This is not a conflict that's contained just to Hezbollah. And I think two things can be true at the same time. One, the military alone solution is unlikely to solve this problem. We have seen that before. We saw it in Gaza just in the last few years. We're seeing it unfold in Iran as well. It is really no different here. But this window of opportunity is what is historic and will not be open forever. And so you can prolong this conflict with a military-only solution and lose that window, because eventually the domestic backlash in Lebanon will be too great. The public anger is rising. It was originally targeted at Hezbollah, where Lebanese were saying that it is Hezbollah's war with Israel. It is not a war that the Lebanese people want. But the more that this violence continues, the harder it will be for that focus to stay on Hezbollah and not be turned toward Israel, especially after large-scale civilian casualties like the ones we saw last week. So a reduction in violence in the structured negotiation is really what is most important in the first instance from these talks. The second part is the United States staying engaged to ensure that that channel holds and that it moves forward so that there is not a repeat of what we saw last week.
Are you suggesting that there's a short attention span inside the Trump administration?
I think the president has made clear that he has a lot of things on his mind, moving from the Iran war already to Cuba. This focus by the Secretary of State is one that arguably should have been there for any number of months. The State Department is not staffed as it should be to kind of follow through with that implementation. But I think this is the best chance that we've got with a government in Lebanon that is under some political pressure here to not be doing this, and yet has gone forward publicly with wanting to move forward with direct talks with Israel. And it's in the U.S. interest to see whether this moment of opportunity can be exploited.
Nadim Houri, we heard that clip at the outset in that report we played of the leader of Hezbollah stating, do what you want, but we're not disarming and we don't recognize what's going on in Washington. What can Lebanon's government do?
Lebanon government was engaged in a process, a slow process, but actually a meaningful process before this latest escalation over the last 6 weeks to disarm Hezbollah. Right now, I think the Lebanese government strategy, to be honest, is they know that Israel has no intention at this point to kind of agree to a ceasefire. But what they're hoping is that the U.S. Will be convinced again to follow a political process, which the U.S. was supporting after 2024. So that's their main strategy at this point for Lebanon, for the Lebanese government at least, to convince the U.S. to put pressure on Israel to go back to a political process. And this is not a process that will lead to a normalization. I think the first step is get a ceasefire. And after the ceasefire, try to negotiate and going back to the armistice agreement that existed with sort of security guarantees for both sides. And then we take it from there. There is a precedent that we should talk about, which is after 1983, Israel at the time, fresh off its military victory and invasion of Lebanon all the way to Beirut, imposed an agreement on Lebanon at the time, which was supposed to normalize relations, but it was done under duress, under occupation. The Lebanese were not united in it, and that arrangement fell apart a year later, with Syrian support for it to fall apart, but also with massive Lebanese rejection of it. So we need to realize that if Israel is serious about wanting to have a peaceful border in Lebanon, it will have to take into account as well Lebanese concerns, because compared to Egypt or to Jordan, Lebanon has suffered incredibly at the hands of Israel. And Lebanon, by the way, did not enter, for instance, the 6-day war. The armistice agreement had lasted for a very long time. So there are real legitimate concerns, and there will have to be a political process in Lebanon, an internal process that will have to be in parallel to the negotiations with Israel. But for that to take place, you will need a ceasefire with security guarantees, which is basically going back to where we were more than 6 weeks ago.
Right, and for there to be a ceasefire, Israel and its defense minister have to relinquish on that talk about a Gaza-style buffer zone, which Israel has established. Israel, which pushed the boundary slightly inside the Golan Heights after the fall of Assad in Syria. For years, it held a buffer zone after the launch of Operation Litani in southern Lebanon in 1978, south of the Litani River. They have to give up on this concept of a buffer zone, of course, Ambassador Besancenot, for there to be any kind of a meaningful agreement?
No, but we have to recognize that the Lebanese government is very brave, because in the conditions where we are, with more than 1 million refugees, with all the destructions and the loss of people, they have accepted to discuss, to start these exploratory discussions at a time where the bombing by the Israelis is giving an excellent pretext for the Hezbollah to say we are the only one to defend the country. And we are in a paradoxal situation where Iran seems to be the protector of Lebanon, which is very paradoxical at this stage. So what is going on in the south is clearly establishing a buffer zone.
Yeah, the buffer zones, by the way, on this map, when you look at the Lebanese part, this isn't all areas controlled by Israel, but it's areas certainly, according to the defense minister, that are coveted.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that there is a real will of annexating this territory in South Lebanon, even if there are some extremists in the Israeli government that would like to do so. But at this stage, I don't think this is the objective of the Israeli government.
All right, and you mentioned Iran. If we may have talks that resume within the next 2 days. That's what Donald Trump told the New York Post a while ago.
Yeah.
If the talks with Iran resume, does the U.S. then tell the Israelis to basically pack up and return to their borders?
I don't know if they will go up to that, but they will certainly ask Mr. Netanyahu to calm down what is going on in the south of Lebanon, because it will be an element of a package by definition, if the things are going in the right direction. And we hear that, but we have been accustomed to hear about good news and then falling down afterwards. So, but if there is some kind of understanding with Iran, clearly this is one of the conditions that the Iranian government has put to stop, to have a ceasefire, or at least to have a very serious reduction of what is going on in South Lebanon.
So, Elisa Ewers, you were worried earlier that perhaps the U.S. could forget about Lebanon with all it's got on its plate. Listening to Ambassador Bezos, it doesn't sound like Iran's going to forget about Lebanon. So how does that bode? For there to be success between the U.S. and Iran, Donald Trump has to rein in Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I think there's always been an element of the discussions with the Iranian regime about its support for terrorism through its proxy forces. And so Hezbollah is one of those. It is hard to imagine that you can divorce it completely from the Iranian file. And so there is a link here. But I think more importantly is that Lebanon is a sovereign state with a government, and it is independent from those discussions as well. So I do think that there's definitely a link here that the president has identified himself, and will continue to do so, I think, as both tracks continue in parallel.
Speaking on Fox News late Monday, the U.S. Vice President, who again was present in Pakistan for those direct talks with Iran last weekend, J.D. Vance saying he saw some movement from Iran, not yet enough. This as the facilitators in Islamabad talk up the prospects, again, of those talks renewing between Washington and Tehran. That's had oil markets easing up. Here's how Israel's prime minister qualified what he sees.
I spoke with the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He called me from his plane on the way back from Islamabad. He reported to me in detail, as members of this administration do every day, on the development in the negotiations. In this case, the explosion of the negotiations.
Noga Tarnopolsky, he reported to me?
You know, it's almost a literary question how to parse that little video that you just broadcast. Please note that Prime Minister Netanyahu made those statements while seated in a bunker in the vicinities of Jerusalem. Netanyahu is engaged in all kinds of internal and external battles, but one of them is that he claims that his life is so endangered that he can't attend his own trial. And that has boxed him in to not being able to attend other things like his own cabinet meeting. And that's why we see this picture. But Netanyahu issued a statement that was really borderline insane from that meeting. I'm sorry to say this, but he declared to Israelis that if it hadn't been for his actions, that Iran would already have atomic bombs, in the plural. And as you say, he said that J.D. Vance reported to him, that they speak with him every day. What we're seeing is Netanyahu do what he's always tried to do, but from a worse situation than he normally is. He's sinking in the polls. Under Israeli law, he has to hold elections by October. And here he is trying to tell Israelis, the Americans treat me like an equal, which more and more Israelis doubt. And he's also saying, only I can protect you. You're in unspeakable danger, and only I can represent you. We see him now on the screen meeting with fighters, Israeli combat reservists on the border. This is in Israel. It's on the border, not inside Lebanon. But again, that is just 2 days ago. And he promised that Israel would have, for the foreseeable future, a military presence in Lebanon. at one point, some of these positions, Netanyahu's promises that only he can make diplomacy work and only he can bring security, some of these are going to have to touch the wall of reality. And I do think, given how diplomatically isolated Netanyahu is, that almost all of this will depend on Donald Trump, not just on his focus, but on his will. And despite the very close collaboration between these two leaders and their friendship, apparently, we have seen more than once that Donald Trump does not shy away from giving Netanyahu orders, for example, ordering the Israeli Air Force to stop bombing in Iran, and humiliating Netanyahu, as he did when he forced Netanyahu to apologize to Qatar from a pre-written script in front of live TV cameras.
Let's push this a little bit about what's the relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. When the U.S. and Israel struck Iran February the 28th, the White House put out images of the U.S. president in the Situation Room of the White House. It's the White House, his own bunker, you might say, surrounded by key generals and cabinet members there. The same Situation Room where, according to the New York Times last week, Trump invited Benjamin Netanyahu on February the 11th. Mr. Trump sat down, says the paper, but not in his usual position at the head of the room's mahogany conference table. Instead, the president took a seat on one side, facing the large screens mounted along the wall. Mr. Netanyahu sat on the other side, directly opposite the president. Elisa Ewers, is Benjamin Netanyahu the equal of Donald Trump? And does J.D. Vance report to the Israeli prime minister?
Well, I have a very simple answer to this question. I don't see any president in that situation making a decision about U.S. forces going into harm's way with anyone other than the commander-in-chief being responsible for that decision. Noga put it very, very well. Their relationship is clearly deep. There is, I think, personal friendship there as well. But we have seen time and again that there also have been lines that President Trump has been willing to make very clear to the prime minister. And I don't think this is any different. At the end of the day, from a U.S. perspective, President Trump is the first and last person responsible for deciding to take the United States to war.
But Elisa, you advised in a previous life the National Security Council and thus the White House and the Pentagon. Is it common for a U.S. president in the war room to sit another foreign leader opposite him?
I think there are a lot of things that President Trump does differently than any other administration in the White House has done. And so I don't know that seating arrangements are necessarily indicative one way or another. I think I can say some things for certain, and that is that the military coordination between Israel and the United States with respect to the war in Iran has been exquisite. And that is a demonstration of military strength and military capability. What is also true is that there are limits to translating those military capabilities and strengths into strategic strengths and successes. And we're seeing that in real time, both with respect to the limits of Israel's military power and also the limits of the U.S.'s military power to gain political and strategic objectives in the end. And so whether or not they sat across from each other in the Situation Room, I think that's less relevant than how both of these leaders think about translating military objectives and successes into strategic and political ones.
Bertrand Besancenot, this war that began on February the 28th, it's a coalition of two, the United States and Israel, leaving out Gulf allies. They were surprised, of course, leaving out NATO allies. There's going to be a meeting of the other members led by virtual call on Friday, the leaders of France and the UK leading that call of what to do about Hormuz. They don't want to get involved. No. Your thoughts on that report in the New York Times last week and what it signifies to you?
But what is very clear is that, of course, it is the President Trump who are making the decision entering into war. But what is true as well is the fact that Mr. Netanyahu is very shrewd in convincing Mr. Trump. We have seen that several times in a way that people think that President Trump has been manipulated several times by Mr. Netanyahu. The way that President Putin did the same with President Trump as well. So, of course, he's making the decision. But apparently, some leaders are very good at convincing him to do what they want.
How come traditional allies aren't as good? Why isn't Emmanuel Macron as good?
But the problem is that apparently President Trump is very hard with the weak people and weak with the strong people. So this is exactly what we are considering.
All right, the U.S. president who's also angry at the only foreign leader who attended his inauguration, telling Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera that he's, quote, shocked that Giorgia Meloni doesn't want to help him with his war. This on the day when the Italian prime minister said Rome was not renewing its defense agreement with Israel. Sitting in beautiful Perugia, Nadim Houri, your ears must be whistling.
You know, what's incredible is that Trump is not asking himself how come some of his closest allies, including Giorgia Meloni, are not following him on his latest folly. I have to say, clearly, Netanyahu influenced Trump, manipulated him into going into a war that went against many of the core interests of very close allies of the US and of Trump Inc. itself, notably the Gulf countries. And that is something that the US should ask of this administration. Why would the US go into a war with Iran? And more importantly, why would the US believe Netanyahu, the same Netanyahu, by the way, who at the time was not prime minister, but briefed the US Congress in 2003 saying, if the US invades Iraq, it's going to be a massive success. And we know the disaster that it was. And here we go again, Netanyahu drawing the US into another disaster. And this time around, some of the closest advisors, some of the closest allies of Trump see the disaster that it is, and they don't want to be part of it. And obviously, there are some very senior people in the Trump administration that also think this was a disaster. Otherwise, they would not have leaked that story with that level of detail to the New York Times. The only question right now, in my mind, it's not who was sitting where and so forth. The only question is, will we see some form of rationality come back to U.S. foreign policy? And will they be able to articulate a security regional order that is not dependent on the whims of Israel and its expansionist government?
So seeing Marco Rubio between the two delegations, did that hearten you, Nadim?
Did it hearten me? I don't know. I'm waiting for actions. You know, I mean, I think that it doesn't give me, because people in Lebanon were still being killed today. And I actually genuinely believe that what Israel and the US are doing in the region is going to spell long-term disaster. When it comes to Lebanon, the Israeli policy, it's insanity to repeat the same thing and expect different results. Israel did the exact same thing that it's doing now in 1978 and in 1982. And look what it got them. It actually got them Hezbollah to become very strong. And if they continue on that path, if they think they can, impose another form of Gaza, they will just get a Hezbollah 2.0 or some other form of armed resistance that will emerge. Everyone in the world sees that. All the US allies actually see that, including the Italians. But it seems the US either hasn't realized, or I really hope that they're starting to realize that they really got bad advice from Netanyahu, and that maybe the US should
All right, let's. I'm going to interrupt you,
Israelis.
Nadim, because we're going to cross to Washington. Yechiel Leiter is the Israeli ambassador to the United States who took part in those talks.
And to Her Excellency Nada Hamadi, the Lebanese ambassador to Washington. We discovered today that we're on the same side of the equation. And that's the most positive thing we could have come away with. We are both united in liberating Lebanon from an occupation power dominated by Iran called Hezbollah. Lebanon is under their occupation, and we are suffering from their constant barrages of missiles and terror attacks trying to cross our border. We talked about a number of things, and most importantly, the vision, the long-term vision, where there'll be a clearly delineated border between our countries, and where the only reason we'll need to cross each other's territory will be in business suits to conduct business or in bathing suits to go on vacation. We made it very clear that the security of our civilians is not up for negotiation. That is understood by the government of Joseph Aoun. And I must say, this was a victory for sanity, for responsibility, and for peace. Because the head of Hezbollah warned the government of Lebanon yesterday not to participate in these talks. And the government of Joseph Aoun bravely said no to Hezbollah. And this is the beginning of a very strong and fortified, consistent battle against Hezbollah. They are weakened as they've never been, and together we'll continue to rid the threat of this Iranian proxy, which is so malign and so malignant in the region. כמה מילים בעברית?
אפשר אולי רק לכאן משהו בעברית? צהריים טובים, השגריר ייתן עכשיו הצהרה בעברית.
All right, we're just watching live images there of Israel's ambassador to the United States in his remarks, who's been speaking about those exploratory talks and giving a nod to his Lebanese counterpart, Nada Hamdan. Just a brief word, because we're out of time on this. Noga Tarnapovsky, you surprised by the tone?
A little bit, I have to say, Francois. This is, I think, a much more positive and even festive tone than I would have expected from a figure so close to Netanyahu. And maybe it is leaving a door open for a new future between these two embattled countries. I do want to add something that he mentioned. Right now, it's become a terrible political fire for Netanyahu that the north of Israel is unlivable. Hezbollah continues to bombard Israel as well, and many of the residents have been forced to flee. The government has not helped them so that there wouldn't be pictures of caravans of Israelis leaving. And so Netanyahu does desperately need something that will help him at least be able to tell Israelis, I can keep you safe. And if these talks will lead to that, maybe we'll see greater openness than I would have expected otherwise.
And it's on that note that we'll leave it. Noga Tarnapovsky, so many thanks for joining us from Jerusalem. Elisa Ewers in Washington, Nadim Houri in Perugia, Italy. Bertrand Besancenot, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.